Good evening and welcome back to Hux Media. Today we will be covering the history of one of the longest lasting programmes, a TV show loved by many from different generations and one you might have grown up with. This is the history of Blue Peter. Oh, and before I start, I want to thank all of you for accomplishing the goal of getting the channel to 100 subscribers, so well done. Anyway, let's get to the actual video. In the early days of television, types of programming were not very varied, as by the end of the 1950s there were only 2 channels, and they didn't air programmes 24/7. BBC One, or just BBC as it was called then, had to fit in different types of shows for different audiences. In 1958, producers at the BBC were commissioned to think of a way to fit in programmes for young children. There was a pre-existing block on radio called Children's Hour, and the show Children's Television Club, but until that point, that was about it. John Hunter Blair, a producer at the BBC, created Blue Peter, which started airing on the 16th October 1958. But why the name and branding? Well, the show wanted its branding to be based on nautical imagery, and Blue Peter is a maritime signal. If you don't know what I mean, it's one of those flags you can occasionally see hoisted on the sails of a ship. The colour blue, whilst also having nautical connections, was thought to be a colour loved by children, and that's exactly what the show wanted to appeal as. The first broadcasts of Blue Peter were only once every week. This might seem like it wasn't as frequent as you might expect, but I remind you, at that time the BBC didn't have a dozen channels that they could air specific types of show on every day. For example, BBC One now is for more central programming, BBC Two is more comedy and art-based stuff, and CBBC, for example, is of course for children. Whereas in 1958, BBC only operated one channel to broadcast every genre of shows. In the first few airings of Blue Peter, Christopher Lace and Leela Williams presented the show. They consisted of features including stories and competitions that the viewers could participate in. In the early 60s, Blue Peter reached its first spike in popularity as it saw new presenters and producers, including Biddy Baxter, a now well-known producer for the show. It also saw many new features arise, but of course also saw the introduction of a very important piece of iconography, the Blue Peter Badge, an award granted to viewers who sent into the show. In 1964, a Blue Peter book was published and would be the first in a series of books released by the show, which would become yearly annuals. Enter the 1970s, and as many other programmes did, like Doctor Who and snooker tournaments over on BBC Two with Pot Black for example, Blue Peter would switch to colour on the 14th September 1970. There's no doubt that in the 70s and 80s, the show progressed just as much as it did in the previous decade. In 1974, viewers saw the opening of the Blue Peter Garden in the television centre. The garden is now a place today, but the original location is still there. In the turn to the 80s, Sarah Green and Peter Duncan joined Blue Peter, and they both would go on to be very famous for presenting the show. In 1983, the Blue Peter Garden was vandalised, which was reported on the show.
Vandals broke into the Blue Peter Garden and caused rather a lot of damage. And one really cruel thing they did was to pour fuel oil into the fish pond. Well, we've drained the pond and we've rescued some of the fish, but a few of them have died and the oil itself has caused a lot of damage.
The vandals then broke our lovely ornamental urn given to us by Mr. Taylor from Barnet. They then smashed up our sundial and then callously threw it into the pond.
Well, if that wasn't enough, they then trampled on the bedding plants as well. Well, we hope to repair the damage, and we may even be able to repair the ornamental urn. But it's very sad to think that a few people take such pleasure from harming their fellow human beings and from hurting animals as well.
And here are the survivors. It really is an absolute miracle that they have survived. Brian has come along to give us a bit of advice. Brian, what do you think of them after the awful ordeal that they've been through?
I think they're looking amazingly well.
Well, it's not a pretty sight, is it, what they did, Percy?
Terrible, you know. People who do this sort of thing must be mentally ill, Janet, mustn't they?
I think so.
Terrible when you come to look at it.
In 1998, Blue Peter's 40-year anniversary was celebrated with a special programme in which the presenters at the time went on a rail tour from Edinburgh to London on the show's own A2 Pacific, named 60532 Blue Peter, a train whose anniversary aligned with the show's. It wasn't the only celebration to look forward to, however, as in this era, the turn of the millennium was coming closer as the year was almost 2000. How did Blue Peter prepare for the new millennium? Well, in the same year, the Millennium time capsule was buried, to be opened in 2050. But as one time capsule was buried, it wasn't long until another would be dug up. Two, in fact. In 2000, two time capsules were opened, the original one from 1971 and another from 1984. The capsules were opened by presenters, and another was buried in the Blue Peter Garden to be opened in 2029. 2008 saw Blue Peter's 50th anniversary, and to celebrate, a special aired featuring many presenters from the programme's history explaining their time working on the show. In 2012, Blue Peter moved from BBC One to airing on CBBC, the BBC's digital channel created for children's entertainment. In 2018, the show's 60-year anniversary came. A new diamond time capsule was buried to celebrate and was to be dug up 20 years later in 2038. And also a new diamond badge was added to the collection of pre-existing Blue Peter badges and was given out from 1 year, February 2018 to February 2019. Per tradition, on the programme's birthday, the 16th October, a special aired, this time on CBBC, called Blue Peter Big 60th Birthday. It really is fitting to the show's history that features most past presenters and other star guests. The most recent part of Blue Peter's history occurred just over 2 months ago, when a time capsule from 1981 was discovered by construction workers at the television centre. The box was opened on this morning of all things, which I find weird as it's on ITV, and also both other time capsules were opened on the actual show itself. However, it was opened by past presenter and presenter at the time of the burial, Sarah Green, and in the same programme, the items from the box were buried again. Blue Peter is still aired on CBBC to this day, and hopefully still will for many years to come, and to be enjoyed by future generations, as it is truly timeless. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you soon for another episode of Media Oddities, coming in just a few days. Anyway, I've been Hux Media, and I want to wish you all a good night. Good night.